What does the Bible say about systemic racism? Now, this is part two of our three-part series addressing this particular topic. In part one, we looked at systemic racism in general. What's its definition? How do people argue for it? And we gave a very brief biblical critique of it. Now, in parts two and three, we're going to be looking at the ideological foundations for positing systemic racism, and this really is where it gets to be such an important issue, and I believe one of actually the biggest issues that's facing our churches today, such that I do think there could very well be many denominations that split over this, that there will be even, I think, a movement towards very liberal theology if there is not a robust response from the church to these particular issues. This really is, I think, going to be the battle of our day, not because of the idea of systemic racism as it is in itself, but the idea is that there are ideological foundations that are quite contrary to the Bible, quite contrary to the doctrines that are taught in the scriptures and to the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, such that if these underlying foundations are enabled to slip in, it will cause great harm to the church of the Lord Jesus Christ. So this is really where the most important aspects of this question come in. So what are the ideological foundations for the positing of systemic racism? Why is it that people will use the kind of language that they do in order to posit these kind of ideas? And really there are two, and we're going to deal with them in parts 2 and 3. And the first one is critical race theory. And the second one is postmodernism. So we'll take critical race theory here in part 2, and we'll do postmodernism in part 3. And it's really these two ideological foundations that really undergird the accusations of systemic racism. Again, this is not to say that we want to be indifferent to racism. We want to fight racism wherever it is, but we also do not want to allow critical race theory and postmodernism to slip in under the guise of false accusations of racism. And that is really the threat that's coming against the church. And so it's important for us to understand not just what systemic racism is and how people argue for it, but also why it is that people are using terms like systemic racism. Why is it that people are doing it? What's the foundation for it? So that brings us to critical race theory. What is critical race theory? Now, the reason this is important is because critical race theory is a neo-marxist philosophy that applies some of the basic principles of Karl Marx and Marxism. And this is where it becomes very dangerous for the church, because all Marxist societies persecute the church, every single one. It is an atheistic, godless philosophy. And wherever there has been Marxism, there has always been the persecution of the church. And so this is why this is such an important thing. Now, the thing that Marx proposed was, he proposed that there was that basically all of society can be understood and described as being a class struggle between two classes. It's always two, and it's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie being this class that's in power, that is striving to retain its power and going to every length to do so, is the idea. And the proletariat, which is the workers, and they are being oppressed by these bourgeoisie. And because of that, then all of the inequities and all of the problems in society can basically be traced back to this class struggle for power. So power becomes a very big issue in Marxist ideology. And then also, because there's always a struggle between these two classes, revolution does as well. So the reason why in Marxist societies, what's promised is that the oppressed class will receive something great if they will rise up and tear down and destroy the oppressing class, and what will come in its place is a classless society. Now, this always goes along with an increase in the size of the government, and this is where the atheism comes in. The government, in some ways, takes the place of God, and the government becomes the ultimate authority and power, and you simply can't go against the government, and the government is there to preserve and to guarantee the rights of all people in this classless society, and so there can be no commitment to anything above God, or above the government, because the government is basically acting in the place of God. So that's the idea of Marxism. Now, what happened then in the 20th century is there was, through a group called the Frankfurt School, there was the development of critical theory, where some of Marx's principles were applied in new ways. This eventually came to America in the form of critical legal theory, particularly at Harvard, where these ideas were applied to legal theory. And the idea with applying them to legal theory is that there's not an objective, just application of principles when we look at laws. Laws are not the application of an objective justice that all can know, but rather laws themselves are a perpetuation of power, and they are put in place in order to guarantee the power of this or that group. And so basically even laws are just a power struggle, which even that is a great perversion of justice itself and of the biblical principles of justice. It's clearly very far from what Romans 13 would teach is the responsibilities of the civil government. Because in Romans 13, there is an assumption that there is, in fact, an objective justice, and the state has been tasked with rewarding the good and punishing the wicked. That's what the state has been tasked with doing. It's been given the sword by God to be a minister of God to this end. So that is completely gone in critical legal theory. Then from Derek Bell, there was an application of these principles to race, and that becomes critical race theory. So that's where it comes from. Critical in that it's critical of society, race. All things are divided by race, and in this way, it's a application of Marxist principles to race. So rather than there being the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, now we have white and black. This is why other minorities have to either be classed as white and black, because in the Marxist world, there are just the power struggle of the two. So there's not a power struggle of five, it's a power struggle of two. And this is why you see, for instance, Asians are sometimes considered as a part of the minority class. Typically, it seems like when it fits the narrative, that they'll be considered, more black. And then at other times, Asians are considered white. But they can't just be Asians. They have to be put in either the oppressing or the oppressed class. Same thing too with Hispanics, the same sort of thing. There needs to be a sense in which they belong to either one or the other of these two classes. And so this is what critical race theory does. It applies these Marxist principles. It calls for the rising up of the oppressed class against the oppressing class. And in so doing, then the promise is that if the system is overthrown and the government is given all power, then there will be a classless society that will be better for the oppressed class. That's the promise. All throughout history, whenever there is a kind of Marxist promise to the oppressed class, it never goes well. It never goes well for the oppressed class. It is not a help to try to produce this Marxist revolution. The fact that this is linked to this idea of systemic racism is actually quite plain. The founders of Black Lives Matter are very clear and open that they are trained Marxists. They are trying to do things based on Marxist principles. All the things that Black Lives Matter have done are very clearly in line with critical race theory. And so, this is, I think, pretty clearly the outworking of this idea of systemic racism. So now, if we look back then at systemic racism and its relationship to critical race theory, you'll notice a couple of important things. On the basis of this system, it is not so much the actions that an individual person does that could be considered racist that becomes the judgment, the criteria for judgment that someone is a racist. It rather is belonging to a particular class. And this is the way it was for Marx as well. This is how it could be justified, that there could be a revolution and all the workers could rise up against all of those who are in the higher class, and they could kill them even if those people were doing nothing to oppress anyone. It doesn't matter, because they are guilty because they belong to the class. They are perpetuating the system of oppression. And the only way that this can be resolved is if they are thrown down and there is a revolution. And in the revolution, then, all things are equalized. There's no other way in the Marxist paradigm. And so this is why then with systemic racism, and particularly even with the reason why the concept of implicit bias is so important within this system, that white people are guilty because they are white. That has to be the idea. You may have done nothing racist in your life. You may not even be conscious of having even a thought of racism in your life. And yet you are still judged as being racist because you are perpetuating a system of oppression. A system of oppression that you may not be able to see what the laws are for this oppression, but it's just there. It's proven to be there because of differences of outcome, which will always be true one way or another. There's always going to be some people that do better than others. It could be in 100 years and 50 years and 20 years and 10 years that black people are way ahead of white people. And if that's the case, Is it possible then that the white people would be able to say that there's a system of oppression that we could rise up? The problem with this Marxist theory is until there is a truly classless society, which is really impossible to produce, there must always be revolution. There must always be a rising up of the oppressed class against the oppressing class. But notice here then, there is actually a judgment because the classes are now determined on the basis of race. There is actually a judgment against somebody or in favor of somebody on the basis of race, which is racism. And this is really the problem, that the ideology that undergirds the accusation of systemic racism is in fact a racist ideology. A white person is guilty. You even hear it said today that the problem is whiteness. That the problem is whiteness. Now think about if that were reversed and you were to say that the problem with society is blackness. Everyone would immediately recognize that's racist. But the problem is critical race theory is really doing the same thing, just in reverse. The problem with society is whiteness. If you belong to the white class on the basis of race, you are determined to be a racist. That is in fact a racist judgment. You are prejudging someone on the basis of race, and you are assuming that there is an implicit bias that they have, and that's perpetuating a system of oppression. Now that's the big problem. It is in fact in this way sinful. The ideology that is undergirding the accusation of systemic racism is a sinful ideology, whereby those who adhere to it are at least moving towards racism. To be fully consistent with the ideals of critical race theory and to be fully consistent with the accusation of systemic racism, it would actually require you to be prejudiced against white people because of the color of their skin. That is required. Just as in every Marxist society, if you apply it to feminism, you have to be prejudiced against men because they are men. If you are applying it to the original bourgeoisie and proletariat, you have to be prejudiced against the bourgeoisie because they belong to that class. It doesn't matter what they've done; they are perpetuating the system merely by their existence. That's the idea. So that's the idea of critical race theory. Now, there are some who will say, well, we recognize that Marxism is atheistic. We can even maybe see the neo-Marxist tendencies of Black Lives Matter and that sort of thing. But and perhaps then we would reject the solutions they propose, but we would still say that they are giving an accurate diagnosis of society. That may be something that even Christians will say, that the Marxists are not right in the solutions they propose, but they are right in the problem that they diagnose. The problem is that the diagnosis is based on criteria that are fundamentally racial essentialism and essentially racist. So there is that problem. That actually the way in which the diagnosis is obtained is sinful. But secondly, it is very doubtful that we can embrace such a large portion of Marxist thinking and then come to conclusions that are not in line with the Marxist solutions that are proposed. That is to say, there is a connection between the diagnosis of the problem and the way the problem is described and the solutions that are proposed. There's a connection between those two things. If you go all the way and say that, well, yeah, I do believe that all of society is about a struggle for power. And I do believe that the most important characteristics about us are our race. And I do believe that all of this struggle for power is divided upon racial lines. And I do believe that there is implicit bias. And I do believe that white people are guilty of perpetuating the system unless they recognize their implicit bias and then come over to our side. So if you believe all of those things, then what kind of possible solution could there be except a revolution? That's really the problem. There has to be a Marxist revolution. And you can even see this with regard to the relationship of the size of the government. The idea is that there'd be no way to hold this quest for power except by granting the government extra power. And so the idea is that all these things go together. The solution that's proposed always falls in after the particular ideology that undergirds the accusation and the problem. And so for all these reasons, it's not a good thing. Again, I think this will be the biggest challenge to the church today. And the church needs to understand, Christians need to understand what the issues are, what is going on behind these accusations, and they need to be willing to stand firm, because if you're a Christian now, you're going to be called very many terrible things. You need to be ready to be called a racist, and that's going to be the cost of following Christ on this issue. So may the Lord grant us strength, and may the church be enabled to stand firmly for His gospel.